Can you hear me now? You're good? All right. All right, well, welcome. Tonight, we're welcoming Marsha Chance, a native of St. Augustine. She's a professional archaeologist, museum educator, and preservation consultant with over 50 years of experience in cultural resource management, exhibit planning and implementation, and a variety of other preservation-related works. She is active in local history-related activities, contributing her expertise and values and beliefs. She has served as the exhibit text author, graphics researcher, and history camp director, and is presently curatorial chair at the Penguin Tech House. She has served as a trustee at St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum. She has served on the St. Johns County Historic Resource Review Board, the Florida Historical Commission, and she's been the president of the St. Augustine Archaeological Association. For 15 years, she was the director of Cultural Resource Division of a large consulting company, overseeing hundreds of archaeological and historical projects and staff archaeologists and historians. She recently served as the leader of Friends of Fish Island, a group that successfully brought about the purpose of the island by the state of Florida because of its significant archaeological and environmental resources. In addition, Marsha Chance is a gardener, caring for the large collection of plants established by her mother at her family home on the Anastasia Island where she now lives. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Ms. Marsha Chance.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm so glad to see you all here. I'm sure some of you care about gardening, and some of you care about archaeology, and some of you care about oranges, and those are the things that I'm going to be talking about today. I want to tell you how this all started. At the Pena Pet House on St. George Street, that's the Historic House Museum, we have a garden. And the garden is maybe, and I don't know for sure, but I think it could be the longest continuously tended garden in St. Augustine. More research might have to be done on that, but I sort of think that's true. So this was sort of like a coalescence of my interests in the history of citrus here in St. Augustine and the Pena Peck House Garden and cultural landscapes, which is a preservation term, and gardening and archaeology all came together. So I do want to say though that there are caveats to a lot of the things I'm going to say. When you start researching plants and flowers and things, there's a lot of contradictory information. You know, you pick up books that'll say the bougainvillea is from Spain. Well, it's not. So considering that there's information that's contradictory, well, I'm doing the best I can here. So what I'm going to talk about today are the oranges in St. Augustine, food plants in St. Augustine, in historic St. Augustine, possible wild plant use in the gardens here, Spanish pleasure gardens, that's what they call them, traveling plants, and local gardens. So I'm going to start by saying what a cultural landscape is. That's a preservation term that just means what humans have done to the place where they live. Picture a farmstead, and there's a house, and there's a barn, and there are trails going off in different directions, and there are outbuildings, and there are plantings, and there might be a vegetable garden. That's a cultural landscape. And so is our plaza, cultural landscape. So let me start about oranges now. The first thing I want to say is, let's see how this goes. No, it's not working. I'm left-handed, so isn't that a beautiful painting? And doesn't it make you want to eat those oranges?
Yes.
We don't eat oranges like people used to. Oranges were so important historically in Spain, in England, in much of the world, and here. So, I always had a question in my mind because people talk about sour oranges in St. Augustine. And they talk, and I wanted to understand the relationship. I thought maybe the sour oranges preceded the sweet oranges. And apparently the rootstock for sour oranges is stronger, so they grafted sweet oranges. Well, here's what I learned. The origins of both kinds of oranges were in the foothills of India and China. The sour or bitter Seville orange and the sweet China orange both came to Spain, but the earliest domesticated citrus sour oranges was 6,000 years ago in those countries. And so you can picture trading orange seeds across the land until they ended up in Spain. And then about 1,000 years ago, the Moors brought the sweet oranges to Spain. I brought the sour oranges to Spain. So why did they like sour oranges? Well, here's a clue. They were using sour oranges for things like we would use lemons for. They were marinating meat and fish, and they were making drinks out of it. And so I just sort of think that its popularity kind of, it was very important. They didn't have lemons at first. So the sweet oranges were introduced to Spain in the mid-1600s. And they were a status symbol if you had sweet oranges at your house. Over time, sour oranges grew wild around St. Augustine. I'll get to their arrival in a minute, but they grew around here so much that the early botanists thought that they were indigenous. But what I want to think about is the orange blossom. The smell of the orange blossom. My mother was from Central Florida, and when we would go down there before air conditioning in our station wagon, she would hang her head out the window to smell the orange blossom, because that's how it used to be when you were driving through the groves. So the earliest example of oranges, see if I can do this right now. The earliest example of oranges arriving in the New World, they came with Columbus. Seeds have been found archaeologically in Haiti, and I think it was at the Puerto Real site. Kelly, you don't say anything if I'm wrong. Which was established in the 16th century when Columbus came back to Haiti in 1493. And the documents indicate also that in 1565, when Menendez came here, he brought orange seeds. We don't have any examples yet of orange seeds as far as I know from that early period in that site that Dr. Deegan has been excavating over the last few years off and on. And so we speculate that that might be because they were feeding the orange peels and seeds and all that stuff to the hogs. On the other hand, orange seeds don't fare very well going through fire. And for archaeologists to be able to find plant remains, they have to be carbonized. They have to still be remaining, but they have to be carbonized so that they will remain in the damp soils. In the 16th century, there were large orange trees in Barcelona. And the first real orange plantation here was in the late 1570s. So the Spanish had not been here very long. In 1586, Sir Francis Drake, also known as El Drake, claimed that he had burned orange trees here when he burned the town. So all the major citruses were here in St. Augustine by the end of the 16th century, but mostly it was about oranges. They seemed to do the best here. In the late 17th century, Jonathan Dickinson this was in 1696, he had been in a shipwreck, South Florida coastline, and he walked to St. Augustine. And he said that the oranges abounded here. So we need to think of oranges as a really predominant item in St. Augustine history in this colony. By the 17th century, the juice of oranges had become really popular in England. They were very fond of it, and they made a drink, an alcoholic beverage called rum, out of sugar and rum and orange juice. And I think that could have been sour orange juice, or maybe it was sweet, or maybe they combined it. So let's look at these. There's an orange grove for you. And there's Drake's fire. Big fire. All the major kinds of citrus were maybe here. There's the shrub drink, hopefully. And here's Jonathan Dickinson's statement, 1696. The earliest exports from St. Augustine in the early 1700s, oranges. So now we come to Jesse Fish. I'm sure some of you know about Fish Island. No, so raise your hand if you know about Fish Island. Oh, yay. Okay, so I'm not gonna tell you the whole story of Jesse Fish. If you want to hear about it or learn it, part of what you can do is go out to Fish Island for a walk. You can find me talking about the archaeology of Fish Island somewhere in the great World Wide Web. The library did a recording of that. And his story is kind of incredible, and I just can't tell the whole story now. So Jesse arrived here in 1736. And he has come to be known as Florida's first orange baron. And there he is. In the mid-1700s, he acquired much of or all of Anastasia Island, where he established a large commercial citrus plantation, which was named El Vergel, which means the garden. He had about 3,000 orange trees at its peak, and he owned it from 1763 until 1790. And in 1760, a promotional pamphlet said orange and lemon fruits from St. Augustine were larger and tastier than those from Portugal or Spain. Does that sound like marketing? I think it was. But anyway, by 1770, he was exporting thousands of oranges as far as London. And they were revered for their sweetness and their thin skins. Now, how he sent barrels of oranges all the way to London, and they were still good when they got there, we don't know. He had some kind of secret packing method, apparently. The trees, the leftover trees, could still be seen at Fish Island in the 1940s. None there now. And the British cookbooks in that period had a lot of recipes with oranges and orange flower water, however you make that. And in 1763, I'm trying to slide. Here's the pamphlet. Okay, in 1763, the end of the first Spanish period, there's the governor's house on the map. And you can see here, all of this is orange trees and garden. And on both sides here, all of that. So the governor, this was a governor who really liked to have a good time. And he had 19 sweet orange trees, 2 lemons, 10 peaches, 1 pomegranate, 1 grapevine, 3 fig trees, 1 quince, and 2 grapefruit, and 95 sour orange trees. So I think that might tell us 2 things. 1, they like some sour oranges a lot. And 2, I think that this means, and this too requires some more research. I think the sour oranges lived longer, lived better in this environment and so forth.
So is that garden behind the current house where we are now, or is it in?
Yes, that would be, this would be where Cordova Street is now, right here. So everything to the west of the governor's house, where we have a park here now. And then the building wasn't as big as it is now, and so there were also plantings on both sides. And there was a church right there in the plaza. So in 1834, 2.5 million oranges were shipped from St. Augustine. Imagine that. So seriously, oranges were a big deal here. It was the basis for the economy. And then this happened. In 1835, they had the worst freeze ever. And there were several other major freezes in the late 1800s that caused the orange industry to start moving southward. And here's another. Look at that. That makes you want to cry, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Now, for the purposes of this talk, I've added on this piece of information here. We are in Markland Place, which was built by the Anderson family in about 1840. Dr. Anderson gave up much of his medical practice to pursue other interests, including growing oranges. And who did he give it up to? Dr. Peck, or the Banya Peck House. The orange groves, again, more research is needed. They extended southward from here, east from here, and maybe west, I'm not sure about that, but south and east, orange groves. And here's an interesting thing about this. In 1840, he also died, Dr. Anderson. And his second wife, Clarissa, was here, and this house was under construction. And she continued the construction. It is half as big as they intended it to be. You can imagine. She finished the house and she stayed here and she managed the farm and the groves. And sometimes she had to rent some rooms to the strangers, and that's what they called them back then, who came to visit St. Augustine. So here we have a woman on business. Her son, also Dr. Andrew Anderson, returned here after the Civil War to manage the farm and so forth. And he sold the property on that side for hotel construction sold it to Flagler. He, by the way, was like this with Henry Flagler. He's his best buddy, traveled with him and so forth. But here's a new piece of information for me. I constantly run across new pieces of information, even though I was born here. Here's a new one. Behind where the hotel was built was the Ball Estate, the grove of the Ball Estate. And in the hotel promotional book, it said, the orange groves of the Ball Estate are famous and are now included in the hotel grounds. In this beautiful garden, one can find realized all his dreams of southern splendor. Nothing can be more luscious than a stroll at noon under the dense canopy. And then, listen to this. This took place at the hotels. Stepping out on the veranda in the early morning, find everybody sucking oranges in the most solemn and businesslike fashion. They make a hole in one end and suck with inflated cheeks like a bevy of ancient cherubs, blowing a trumpet and suck in sweet silence, seemingly oblivious of all that is passing around them. Now, I've never seen an adult sucking on an orange. But when we were children, at least the people around here, that's what we did. You know, you cut a hole in the orange and never mind getting that peeling off, you just sucked it dry. But this is so interesting to think of these people at the turn of the century, the bustles and the contacts and all that, sucking on these oranges.
The luscious oranges.
The luscious oranges. And those trees rose in 1895. Bam. That's right. Okay, now. Raise your hand if you ever knew Mary Louise Banta. Okay, Mary Louise told me before she passed away a few years ago in her late 90s that in the 20s and 30s, all the yards and all the gardens in St. Augustine had orange trees in them. Everybody grew oranges. And then they got some kind of disease. She didn't know what it was. The state of Florida came through and cut them all down. The last orange grove in St. Augustine was on San Marco Avenue, across the street from the Mission of Nombre de Dios parking lot. It was there until 1972, 73. Dr. Garnett came here in 1883 and purchased 20 acres, and he planted over 200 trees of 22 different varieties. Who knew they could be that many? And for those of you who are local, or if you've been here long enough, M.K. Murphy was Mr. Garnett's daughter. And she was the woman who rode at the front of all of our parades on her beautiful horse until she was up in her 90s when she led our parades. Gotta throw in these little bits and pieces for the local there. It was the Easter parade in Marshall. And look at that. There are ladies in their Victorian garb and on the ladder picking oranges at Garnett Brook, 1909. And here's what's there today. A hotel. Oh, yes. There was a driveway like that. Palm trees. We don't know if any of these palm trees were part of that. There's a postcard picture from 1973. Now, I'm going to go on to food plants. We always think about what were people eating here. They were fishing, they were eating mullet, they were doing oysters, so on. Here's a quote from Gardens of New Spain, How Mediterranean Plants and Foods Changed America. And I quote, Spanish ruled La Florida from north central Florida through Georgia and South Carolina, birthplace of old world gardens and gardening of all America, north of Mexico. I think that means that St. Augustine was the birthplace of old world gardens on this continent. So how did that happen? In 1493, when Columbus arrived in Hispaniola, He brought seeds of grain and vegetables and greens and like grapevine cuttings, of course, didn't make it, sugarcane cuttings, melons, and oranges and lemons. What else did they have? They had the foods that they encountered when they got here that the Native Americans provided for them and showed them how to grow. And if they hadn't been here to do that, they might not have lasted. We might not be here in St. Augustine. The indigenous people were farming corn, beans, and squash and pumpkins. And they collected hickory nuts. The corn was the most popular thing, was their mainstay. And these foods had come to them by Central or South America. We don't really know how exactly they got here, but they got here. Whether they came through the islands, whether they came up around, whether they came by boat, we don't know, but they were here. We do know that by 1521, the squash and pumpkins had begun to cross the Atlantic from South America to Spain. So the Spanish were already taking those vegetables from South and Central America back to their home country. For the Spanish, the corn took the place of wheat here, because wheat would not grow, even though everyone kept trying to grow it right up to the reddish area. So they took corn back to Spain. So in 1565, oh, there's some of those things right there. Then in 1565, Menendez got here and he had all these plant seeds and cuttings and so forth with him. In the late 1600s, Father Alonso de la Torriondo, the native of St. Augustine and was the priest in the parish here, listed a bunch of plants that they were trying to grow. Everything you can think of. The olives obviously didn't work. The peaches didn't work very well. The grapes didn't work at all. But they were collecting hickory nuts, and they were growing trying to grow cherries, mulberries, pomegranates, watermelons, melons, blueberries, and the citrus and so forth, and peanuts. And I thought, peanuts? I thought peanuts came from Africa. Well, they didn't. The peanuts started out in South America, Peru and Brazil, and the Spanish carried them across the ocean. And that's how they came to be in Africa. So here we see that it's evident they were trying to grow everything. And we know that everything doesn't grow here. A later author, 1931, listed, he had another list that I don't know where he got it, from the late 1500s. And they're still trying to grow wheat. Now they were trying things like eggplants and turnips and onions and things that did grow here. But the interesting part of it is that they were trying to grow a bunch of herbs, which tells us, for those of us who grew up without any herbs in our food here in the South, our mothers did not use herbs very much, maybe parsley. But from Spain, they brought coriander, fennel, parsley, rue, whatever that is, thyme, and saffron that they were trying to grow here. I want to note that even though they couldn't get the European grapes to grow here, they were making wine from the wild grapes that are here. How many of you have wild grapevines on your ground that you fight with constantly? Yes. And also mulberries. They were probably making wine from the wild mulberries. So now let's talk about the archaeological evidence. I will talk about this. By the mid to late 1700s at Fort Matanzas. Fort Matanzas was used from 1742 to 1821. So we've got remains of squash with pumpkin, hickory nut, bottle gourd, and corn. All that came from the Movements, the native people. Also in that collection from Spain, watermelon, other melons, hazelnuts, olives, almond, and citrus. So the olives had come in a big jar, and the seeds got discarded, is what I think. From Central America, that collection contains chili pepper, tomato, and peach. Now, I want to mention that I keep saying interchangeably squash, melons, pumpkins, and so forth. And that's because they all come from their cucurbits, or I'm going to try to cucurbitaceae. Not going to do that here. All melons, squash, gourd, and pumpkins are subgroups of one group. And archaeologically, you can't always tell the difference. These carbonized seeds. And also that diversity is because they interbreed promiscuously. The Latin root word for melons means to commit adultery. I swear I read that. I still don't know if I believe it, but I read it, so here it is. Now, the stem of those things, you know how hard and tough that stem is of a pumpkin, for example. That thing also, or not just the seeds, but that thing, and that thing is called a peduncle. A peduncle. Carbonized. Now, how do archaeologists find these things? By flotation. You take a sample of soil from your excavation unit and you take it back to the laboratory and you put it in water, and these carbonized things float to the top, and then they can be collected. And a subset of archaeologists is archaeobotanist. We actually have one archaeobotanist who's not here tonight, but lives here and is working on collections right now, again, from the Fountain View site. Right, Kathy? Okay. So let's see what we have next. There's another list here from our archaeological plant list, and it has red peppers and yucca. Who knew that the fruit of yucca is edible? Peaches, they're still trying to grow those peaches. Passion flower, prickly pear cactus, purslane, and most of these are wild plants. So the native people were teaching them about the wild plants. The Franciscans had mission gardens. So that's one of the ways that these plantings were spread, because the Franciscans established missions in the Indian villages. And those villages stretched up to the north into Georgia, to the west over to Tallahassee, and were out in the central part of the state as well, over towards Gainesville. And archaeologists have been for years looking at different sites. And the Franciscan missionaries lived in, the way they did this, they were attempting to Christianize native people. And so they would go out and live in a nice, kind way in the village, and they would build a church and a place for themselves to live and plant a garden, and it worked out pretty well. Now, by the mid-1700s, 4 types of citrus had gone wild. So that's where those orange blossoms get to the orange blossom. But anyway, now Governor Grant was the first British governor here. And he too was attempting to try to grow everything. And he was trying at guano. He had a big plantation up there where guano is at GTN Nur on the north end. That's where his archaeological sites are. And the list of everything he was trying to grow is really long, but what actually did well for him were melons, cucumbers, squash, radishes, parsley, cabbage, beets, citrus, and oranges, and lemons, and sweet potatoes, and corn. So all these other things fell by the wayside. We can assume, I think, based on this, that these are the crops that probably did the best for the Spanish too before his time. And during Spanish times, by the way, the Spanish Cuba was providing an influx of seeds and cuttings. And from the old world, they were growing some of these things I've mentioned, but like watermelons and figs and so forth. But this is an interesting fact. The peaches and melons did so well in Spanish times. Peaches, especially in Georgia, not here, that they were later thought to be, the early settlers thought they were indigenous.
What makes the climate different from Georgia to Florida?
A little cooler,
That's it.
not always cool,
Different soil.
but it's soil, the inland soils are different. I don't really know. I don't think probably peach, I'm guessing that peaches don't grow too on the other coast.
Might be longer to stratify too, because it's not very cold here.
Yeah. So all these things, they kept attempting to grow. Okay, so now let's talk about the wildflowers and plants and trees that they probably became part of what they were growing. From the archaeological record, we know about hickory nuts and persimmon and blackberry and blueberry and plum and cherry and grape, and all of those were wild. So I started thinking, well, what else was out there that they might have been growing? So out of my head came these ideas, and some of them are, well, one of them is not edible. The rest of them, some of them aren't edible. Some of them are flowers. Boston fern, arrowroot or kunti. You all know about arrowroot, the thickener. Well, the kunti plant, which grows around here and is in my yard, has a major tuber, and the native people use that tuber to turn it into flour. Now, it is poisonous, so they had to do a lot of work on it to be able to use it. But it's also a very attractive plant, and that's why it's in my garden. It's pretty, and it grows, because it's supposed to be here. The Spanish bayonet, local passion flower, which is also known as maypop, Wisteria, Gaillardia, Turk's cap mallow, black-eyed Susan, and beautyberry. Those are the ones that came into my head. And then I thought, well, maybe trumpet vine, wild azalea, pine lily, and coral bean. All of these are beautiful wild flowering plants. So then I found a list of plants from an archaeological site, the Rivera Garden site, 16th century on St. George Street. It's excavated in the 80s, maybe. Anyway, okay, here's what they found. Honeysuckle, purslane, lantana, kunti, sago palm, fire lily, wild azalea, wisteria, yellow jasmine, beautyberry, and maypop, some of which I had guessed at. So what this tells me is that the Spanish and the British women, in parentheses, these are women, were planting beautiful wild plants into their gardens and creating an aesthetic in their new colony. And they were creating what we might call their own pleasure gardens. So now, there are those things. Those are all wild flowers. This one's edible, purslane. This is the kunti plant right here. Very attractive. That, in case you don't know, is the wild azalea over there. Lantana is considered an invasive plant here now, and it looks like that. But there apparently were two types of lantana here that were white flowers and that are native. Don't anybody argue with me about that. found that sentence.
The yellow flower, you know?
I think that's probably yellow jasmine. I
Mexican jasmine?
don't know.
Sorry.
I don't know. Okay, so moving along to the pleasure gardens of Spain. As many of us have observed, historic Spanish paintings really show a lot of fruits, vegetables, and flowers. They're really popular subjects in the 1600s, which continued into the late 1800s. Here, that's a painting by Juan Ariano from 1668. And you can see identifiable flowers and fruits there, very evident. Here's one from the 1800s. This artist name is Rafael Barros. Here's there's supposed to be another one in there. It's gone. Okay. Spanish pleasure gardens have certain characteristics, and one of them is they're trying to evoke romance, and they always were. And also, they were indicators of status in Spanish garden. And here's a quote: Spanish gardens are a mixture of grandiose and pastoral curves and columns of vibrant colors and pastel hues, influenced by Persian, Roman, and Moorish designs. Some of the other characteristics include water features, fountains or whatever, ornamental details, pergolas, shady settings, outdoor living spaces, like we didn't invent that, stone paths. The difference between the Spanish garden and the French garden is that the Spanish garden is much more wild and free than the French gardens. The oldest Spanish garden that exists today was created in 1755 by King Ferdinand. It's the Royal Botanical Garden of Madrid, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it has a very natural aspect to it. Sorry, I don't have a picture of it. I couldn't find it. Plants that appear in authentic Spanish gardens include succulents and cacti, as well as things you might expect, like bougainvillea, lavender, passion flowers, plumbagos, hibiscus. Here's some pictures of gardens. Native Mediterranean plants are lavender, oleander, snapdragon, cornflower, and the red carnation, which I thought about wearing in my hair, but it didn't happen. The red carnation is the national flower of Spain. I think it would be the red rose, but it's not. The red carnation. More gardens. Does this look like your backyard? We wish. So I have a few facts about the flowers that will be found in these gardens. Roses have always been the most important flower in the Western and Muslim world. And the rosary, as the rosary, refers to a garland of roses. The magnolia, there was a magnolia there, which came from the Far East, and there's a magnolia here. Magnolia was the first Asian species to arrive in Europe in the 18th century. The cactus in these gardens is considered the guardian of the home. Lavender was an early Mediterranean crop that originally came from the Far East. And aloe vera, which is popular for these gardens, is native to Arabia. Now, the traveling plants. You see this map with arrows going back and forth and back and forth. Well, that's the simple version. I had a hard time with this. I'm going to show you my map. I just had to get this straight. You can see that every color of arrow, like, here's blue, and all these plants go to Spain, and then they come back to St. Augustine. This one goes from Mexico, that's the Zinnia, goes to Spain, comes back to St. Augustine. So that's what the traveling plants were about. The Spanish people, the men were collecting all these plants in South America and Central America and hauling them back to Spain one way or the other. Then they brought them here. And I think that this is something that bears pondering, that they took the trouble to do this, because a lot of it is about flowers. So those Spanish were, pleasure garden was a big thing. It had to be, even back then. So, so in the 1500s, the sunflower was found in North America. It was in Spain by the 16th century, in the 16th century. And it had spread to South America when the conquistadors arrived. There's the sunflower over there, and another map. The canna lily was found in South America and in Spain by the 16th century. The marigold is interesting. It was found in Central America and Mexico. It was collected by the Spanish in the 16th century and it spread rapidly and became associated with the Virgin Mary. It's not the one I want. Let me see here. Let's see, we got this on here. Oleander was native to North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean and was traced back to China. And we sure have got it here today. Snapdragons were a Mediterranean plant that they brought here. Geraniums were popular throughout Europe and were introduced by the Dutch. They came down to Spain and then they came over here. Now we get to the passion flower. Passion flower, I've mentioned it repeatedly. The passion flower that they brought from Spain, from South America, was a red flower. And you can maybe buy them sometimes here now. But this is the one that I've always thought of as a wild flower in Florida. And it was discovered in the 1600s, and it was deeply symbolic. The Spanish Catholic conquistadors. And it was later found in North America by the Jesuits. The symbols that, does anybody know about this? Let me show you. They saw 3 nails. These are nails. See the, here's, you can see 3. 1, 2, 3. 3 nails. Crown of thorns. And curly-cued around in there. Can't see it very well. It's the whip. There's supposedly 11 species of this. And have always been, apparently since that time, considered really significant to the Catholic Church. Now, in the second Spanish period, from Governor Cespedes, now we're up to the 18th century, from Governor Cespedes' records in East Florida, he mentions in the plaza, now we have a cultural landscape. In the plaza in early 1785, we had oleander growing from roots brought from Spain, Canary Island jasmine, wild honeysuckle, calendula, a native of Spain, marigold from South America, and zinnia from Central America. So if you can picture any of these flowers in your mind, That's a lot of flowers. We don't have any flowers in the. And we definitely don't have orange trees. And it would be a great thing to have an orange tree or two there. But taking care of an orange tree is maybe not something that the city wants to do. We do have a couple of orange trees at the Pena Peck House. And one of them is pitiful and the other one isn't, does pretty well. Now, here are some of the other plants that I just talked about. There's some that I didn't. There's an nasturtium over there. Edible. There's zinnias in the top corner. Now, 1789, bougainvillea. This is the one that I said, I found books that said bougainvillea is a native of Spain. Well, no, it's native to South America. And this is an interesting story. It was discovered by a French botanist whose name was Pimmercon in about 1780. Assistant who was secretly female. He published in 1789 about bougainvillea, and he traveled around from Peru to Brazil. The magnolia, I already mentioned the magnolia. Wisteria, which we love around here, who doesn't love wisteria, is from the Far East and became popular in Spain in the late 17th century. The zinnia, Central America, in Spain by the 1700s. This, I think we done lots. Nasturtium, 1700s. Coneflower, sweet pea, 18th century. I mentioned the lantana situation. Throughout Southern Europe and in New Spain, which is over here, California, New Spain. There were a lot of floral gardens planted for religious functions. They included ornamentals from the old world, as well as edible plants, which is interesting that the priests were not just focusing on what they needed to eat, but they were creating beauty because they were from a place where they had those beautiful gardens. From the Mediterranean, there was the anemone, the calendula, and the marigold. I mentioned the marigold. It's an annual weed. It has a single flower, and it's edible, and it was called Maygold, May-gold, marigold, and it's the Virgin Mary flower. Jasmine and lavender and iris came in from the Far East. And here's another interesting fact. Chanel No. 5 is made from jasmine. And there are those things that I just mentioned. Now we get to the really lovely part. Now I meant to bring my pointer, but I'm just going to have to use my finger. St. Augustine Garden. Now, when people look at the maps of St. Augustine, what are they usually looking at? They like to look at the layout of the streets. They're looking at the structures. They're trying to find out the history of the buildings, the historical society library. You go there and you ask Charles, and he tells you who owned what building, who looks in between. So I started looking in between. So here is the Pena Peck House. Here's the plaza. Well, it was called the Parade Grounds. There's the Pena Peck House. Look at all the green space around behind those buildings. And here we are. Now there's the governor's house. This map, this is the, this is the Jeffries map. On the Solis map in 1764, there are a couple of examples of what I'm going to show you on this one. But on this one, there are 5. The Jeffries map, 1769. And this is a close-up. So here's the Pena Peck House with a formal garden between the wings. And this is the property line going out here, and you can see greenery growing in here. But I started really looking at this map. And what I found, I don't know if you can see this, there's this huge garden or grove or something that's geometrically designed. It has a center point, which might have been a fountain or something. It has walkways going this way and this way and this way. And there are 5 of these on this map. Here's one. Here's one over here, behind the governor's house. There's another one on St. George Street. There's a couple down there, and there's one small, interesting little formal garden looking right there. The little marks, like you see that these little dark marks, if you look at them up close, it's one tree with a shadow. Every tree is a shadow. And when you look at it, you know, this is blown up hugely. They appear to have low walls around them. And at first I thought they're orange groves. Now I don't feel so strongly that they're orange groves, but I think this is very interesting. Is this, and here's another subject for study. Do these belong to the government? Did these belong to these people right here who lived in these 2 houses? This is the treasurer's house. He was the second in command, the Pena Peck house, to the governor. And this house doesn't have one of those, but there are 5 of these. So maybe they're public gardens. Maybe they're public groves that you can promenade through. Of course, this is in the early British period, this map. But it does kind of bring to mind the pleasure map concept and the, you know, the promenading in the beautiful garden. This is something that I found that gave me an idea. I just found this, gave me an idea of what the ladies might have been doing here in the late 1800s about gardening. And they called them the people who visited strangers. So this is the stranger's account of the coach ride from Piccolata to the downtown hotels in the late 1800s. The ride is charming. The whole distance is garlanded by flowers of every variety. Lilacs, honeysuckle, azaleas, sunflowers, and 1,000 varieties of small flowers which enamel the ground. Really? I have the idea in my mind, which can never be proven, I'm sure, that ladies were going out there and seeding wildflowers and or planting some of these things. This was probably in the spring. There's another account that makes it sound like the nastiest, worst looking place with the puddles. Yeah. And you know, just a terrible entrance into St. Augustine. What's going on here? I think it's seasonal for one thing. But you know, my mother, when I was growing up on Anastasia Island and our house was surrounded by vacant lots, imagine that. My mother would seed the lots with wildflower seeds. So is that what the 1,000 varieties of small flowers which enamel the ground were? Were they beautifying? Is this an early beautifying the entrance to St. Augustine? I think it might be. Okay, so in 1938, the Historic American Building Survey certificate that was written up to go with the Pena Peck House has a hand-drawn garden plan that accompanies it. And that should be from the time that Anna Burke left the house to the city, which was in 1931-ish. She left it in 31, they drew it in 38. It shows a large square vegetable garden that was still there, 2 date palms, oleander, hibiscus and fig, and they're actually marked on the plan, which is kind of interesting. Of course, the ones exchanged had already taken over that property by then, but I'm sure they didn't have control much of the garden. In today's garden, we try to use these plants that would have been there, and we have some of those. The hibiscus, we have a couple orange trees, we have a passion flower vine, roses, wild queen bee, red hibiscus, rosemary, marigolds, and so. We got another page here. Page. I skipped a page. This. There it is. Here's a bird's eye view of the house when it was a one-story building. The oranges or whatever were out here. There's the formal garden area in the center. The first Mrs. Peck arrived, they took over that house in 1837, and she borrowed a book from Mrs. Anderson. This house is called Gardening by Mr. Jenks. And she copied pages on the Irish potatoes, English peas, lima beans, beets, cucumbers, and asparagus. And Jenks recommended, now all you gardeners get ready, because here's what you have to do. Jenks recommended planting peas in the ground, and then, and this is a quote, spread with well-rotted manure mixed with salt grass and marsh mud. Now, if you're new in town, you may not know what marsh mud smells like. But believe me, mixing these three things together would really be a labor of love, really trying to get those. Mrs. Peck also planted local daddle peppers, so she had been sucked into the daddle pepper thing. And she was from Lime, Kansas. And she planted them near the kitchen to flavor hot vinegar, and she grew garlic. By the way, in the late 1800s, the top 10 Victorian flowers, which rose was #1. And then violets, lavender, camellia, daisies, and violets. The other thing about this garden, well, that's funny. It sort of slipped down somehow. But you can still see the 2 palm trees, and you can see this image on the cover of the New Monthly Magazine. This is of the ancient city. December 1874. Apparently, Dr. Peck's 2 palm trees were a big deal. They were kind of famous. They were pictured all the time. And they were, well, ours are Sylvester or toddy date palms. Here's where date palms from India. And they had been naturalized in the Caribbean, but there must not have been too many of them here. The dates aren't edible, but the sap is used for a drink. And there they are. And that's the outside of the house. This is a painting by Felix de Crano from the Flagler era. And the only other thing, how's my time?
We're 8.
Okay, well, I'll just say, Dr. Peck was known to grow medicinal herbs, which is something that doctors did back then. And we don't know what he grew in this garden, but he grew some medicinal herbs. So I learned that in the early 19th century, when he was there, the most commonly regarded primary ailment in civilized society was
Social.
constipation. So a doctor would have been growing things for laxative like aloe, rhubarb, and senna. For spasms, they had plants for spasms, cancer, gout, emetics. The Civil War, this is interesting, in the Civil War in the 1800s, soldiers carried chamomile, mint, licorice, yarrow, horsetail, and sage with them if they could get it. So that's the end of my talk. And that's the pain effect I'll start with today.
Presentation.
Any questions? Yes.
Question just a comment about passion flower. When I first started, when I first started going to see colony, passion flower, wild passion flower was everywhere.
I love
It was also in the basement.
it.
And I bought some plants to open my garage next door. I cut it back and it's blank you. God. I tried planting it 3 more times to get it on. And then 3 years ago, wild passion just sprang up on the wood line.
And I was very lost to grow.
Yeah, and I wanted to the passion. See, but they were good. And now it's on again.
What color? It'll come back.
Yeah,
I think it'll come back. What color?
The University of Florida just designated this year that the passion flower is officially invasive. Yeah, this happened.
Well, I'm not buying it, because all these documents say that it was a wild plant that was here with the Spanish guy. So I'm not gonna accept that. Any other questions? Yes.
When you say carbonized, does that mean it's been burned?
Yes, it's been through a fire and turned into charcoal. That's why it floats. Didn't burn up, turned into like charcoal, like there's that leftover log in your fireplace that we burn, it's just, it's char, turned to black stuff. Any other questions?
Well, does the charcoal specimen that you recover lend itself to any analysis of genetic content?
Genetic content.
Well, in other words, if you found something that wasn't carbonized, you can sometimes tell its heredity and its origin.
Maybe. Yeah, Kathy, are you here? Kathy, did you hear that question? He said, could the carbonized remains, could you do genetic studies on it? You know?
Even so, with our about they have done some, but it is so fragile that burning to.
Yeah, that was my word.
Actually,
That's why I wanted to.
We have a specialist here. It's one of the few specialists in the southeast. You can count on one hand. Maybe this can, archaeobotanist, and she really knows her stuff. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna put a pizza bar now.
I like that.